Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hey there, and thanks for hitting play this week on another Art of Procurement podcast, where we seek to elevate the impact of procurement, one conversation at a time. And today, for the second time in 3 weeks, we actually head back to Australia. And I'm joined on the show by Donovan. So Gordon is one of the leading thinkers in procurement on the topic of skill and behaviour development. I'm also honoured to call Gordon a good friend. We've authored a number of articles together, and today will be Gordon's second appearance on the show. I do want to say it's not all good though. Gordon is a Manchester City football fan, but I do mostly let him off for that because at least he's been in it for the long haul. So back to procurement. Today we continue our recent theme of procurement capability development, and it's with a focus on how we can actually scale the behaviours that we want to drive in our teams. We start by talking more broadly about capability development before we then arrow in on capability frameworks. To me, a good capability framework is as much of an art as a science. They can be too simplistic, but more often they get way too complex to actually be actionable. So we try and unpack, what should we think about when we look at building a good and effective capability framework for our teams? Well, since his last appearance on the show, Gordon's had a couple of different roles. And so I started by asking if he could just update us on what he's working on today.
So since we last spoke, I've moved on from Metro Trains. And I spent some time working at SAP Ariba, which was fantastically interesting when it comes to understanding more about technology. And then I've recently moved and taken a leadership transformation role at a private not-for-profit healthcare company. So I'm currently director of procurement and supply chain at a private healthcare not-for-profit company in Melbourne. So driving through a whole bunch of change that we need to do to help us really achieve our potential. There's an awful lot of things that we can achieve and deliver, both for the organisation and as a procurement organisation as well. And there's lots of great things that we can do around the sort of value beyond savings that you and I talk about, because it is fundamentally aligned with the charter of the organisation, which is around with it being a not-for-profit, we've got an obligation to help the community as well. So there's some really fun things that we can start getting to do. But it's a journey, like any transformation. There's a whole thing to do, but it's good fun.
It's encouraging to hear that kind of interest in value beyond savings, that you have the opportunity to drive a value prop that isn't just savings based. Now, that's not, of course, saying that savings aren't important, but it means that I guess your stakeholders and your leadership kind of appreciate that it's not all about just saving money at all costs.
No, that's right. I mean, I report through to the CFO, and she has got savings focused, and we do talk about it an awful lot. But it's one of 10 KPIs, and it's actually number 9. So it is an important thing that we've got to deliver. We've got to deliver value, because whilst we're not for profit, we're also not for loss. And the ability for every dollar that we save to go back into the organisation to build additions to the hospital, to put more beds on, to buy new pieces of equipment that can fundamentally save people's lives. I don't take that lightly. That's a massive responsibility. But as part of our charter and as part of our strategy, we're just actually refreshing the organisational strategy at the moment. And it's the patient is at the centre of everything we do, but it's also the community is at the centre of everything that we do. And as part of our not-for-profit status, we have to obviously deliver value back to the community. Now, what the community is going to groups to discuss what does community mean, and depending on who your stakeholder group is, the community means different things. So we've got some good work to do. We've obviously got to look at things we're doing with our supply base. For me as well, technology from a healthcare perspective, is pretty important. So how do we attract the latest and greatest technology? And we're pretty fortunate. We've just bought a whole bunch of robotics. So I think we've got 8 or 9 robots across the group now, which is going to be a lot more accurate in terms of the surgeries and the things that are performed, and therefore deliver better patient outcomes, shorter length of stays, and less time in the operating table, more precise cuts, if you like. So how do we work with our providers to help them bring to us these new pieces of technology, and then how do we help fund them? How do we help get more surgeons to want to come and work for us? So it's a slightly different model here than, you and I growing up in the UK, and probably, and I'm not quite sure what the US model is, but none of the surgeons are actually employed by us. They're all what's called visiting medical officers. And so the patients choose the surgeon. And so it's around how do we work with our surgeons to keep them coming here? How do we work with other surgeons to bring
the patients?
Because they bring the patients, and therefore there's revenue that comes with that. And what we believe is a better outcome for the patients as well because of our facilities, our staff, the way that we treat them, our ethics, our philosophies. And it also means that, the decisions that we make around some services aren't dollar driven. Cleaning, for instance, is a great example. Lots of people, most organizations, probably not in healthcare, most organizations outsource cleaning. It's probably one of the first things that everybody does, right? Not here. The public areas are outsourced, but anything that can come in touch with the patient has to be a member of staff. Yeah, because it's not just about cleaning to a specification. It's about ensuring that the patient is well, ensuring that the patient is safe.
It becomes a core competency.
Absolutely, yeah. So these guys are trained, and we're all trained that when we come into contact with patients, is that we basically make sure that the patient is well. And I come into contact with patients. They're walking around the hospitals and going to speak to my stakeholders and my team that's dispersed out amongst the group. It's something that's indoctrinated into you in terms of the patient's obviously the most important person here. Let's make sure the patient's well. And that the patient and the families of the patient are knowing where they're going, and we've got good wayfinding, and they're fully informed about everything that's going on, and they're informed about their care, and that we treat them all with respect. And that's massively important. And it's really hard to do that with a service provider, when they're coming into contact with the patients all the time. I'm not saying they can't do it, but I think people feel a sense of ownership when they work for the organization that if they work for a partner organization, they might not feel, because they're almost working to a specification. It's not really a specification when they're employed, right? So,
do you feel that it all being centered around the patient, that informs how you go about your work as a procurement professional and a procurement leader? In that most of the organizations we work for, and I think most of us feel this way, you're not that connected to the product or the end customer. And so, you start to make decisions about things that feel more abstract. But when it's a patient, it's somebody who, you can see in front of you, that perhaps you just take a different approach, or there's, I don't want to say an additional level of rigor, because that's not fair, because that says that, there's no rigor when you don't have that. But I've got to imagine that being closely connected to the customer, and therefore people who don't feel that in their industries that they're in, could benefit from understanding the customer in more detail.
I think that's absolutely true, and we have a saying in the procurement team. It's actually my head of clinical procurement who came up with this, and she's got a nursing background. And she turned around and said that one of the parts of the vision and purpose that the procurement function has, and it's a way that we align ourselves to our organizational strategy, is that the patient is at the end of every decision that we make. So when we're looking at some of the clinical products, we've got to consider, what does this mean for the patient outcome? And part of that is, do the nursing staff like to use this? Do they feel comfortable in using this? Do the doctors and the surgeons who are going to be using this trocar, do they feel comfortable in using this? Are they happy that it's giving the patient outcome that they want to achieve? So it is a different kettle of fish. It is a different part of it, and as part of our sourcing process, we take that into account. And as part of our, we've got a pretty basic 4-step strategy, or 4-step sourcing process, from analysis to strategy to engagement to sort of close out. Part of that strategy decision is around evaluation strategy, and that's where it sits. And that's a really key part of it, to turn around and say, how is this going to impact the patient? And it's not just clinical products. This is the thing that we're driving across now. I've got a non-clinical team and a clinical team and a capital sourcing team, from the sourcing side that kind of runs to me. But then I've also got the supply chain. So the supply chain reports through to me as well. I've got a warehouse with a couple of thousand lines in it. we've got a whole bunch of work to increase the service to our stakeholders and ultimately our patient. So when we look at stakeholder management, for me, it's more than just the doctors and the nurses that we're actually servicing. It's the patient and the patient's family as well, because one of the things, and we're doing it right now actually with coffee shops that we're looking at potentially either taking out to market or renegotiating. We're still in that kind of strategy stage. Whilst there's a bistro, there's a cafeteria, if you like, that both delivers for staff and for patients and patients' families. So not patient food, but if they want to go out and grab a sandwich or something like that, and they don't want to have it room service delivered, then they can come to this cafeteria if they want to go for a walk. And the same with the families, they can go there. But it's very light, it's bright, and it's quite loud. And that's not true for everything. We've got to produce a different area that's a lot more quieter, that's more subtle, that's probably darker, because, not everything good happens in hospitals. And we have to provide space for that. We have to do that. So that's a different decision we're making there. And it's not just around the patient, it's more about the patient's family. And our staff, and the staff as well, because, one of the reasons why people get into healthcare is because they want to help people. That's where it's driven from. And, people take things, really personally if things don't go well, as you would hope and expect them to do. So it's a really different kind of approach. And I've done healthcare a few times in my career. And it draws me back because you feel like you are making a difference to people's lives. At the end of the day, I can say to my team, if you do a fantastic job, take a look out the window of that hospital, take a look out the window of the wing that's been put onto that hospital. You built that because of the job that you do.
Yeah, and it's not often that we have the opportunity to connect what we do with something that's so important.
So we talk about a procurement sphere of influence, from a wider procurement perspective. And, there's, one I've just listened to from one of your podcasts talk about his hatred and my hatred and your hatred of the phrase seat at the table.
Yes, a couple of episodes ago with Doug Park.
Yes, that's the one. Yes, and I always enjoy it because I always think if I'm a furniture buyer, I am actually buying a seat at the table, but that's potentially a different issue. We talk about sphere of influence of procurement. There is nothing that goes on in procurement within the organisation which I work for now that we're not involved with and that we're not welcomed into. Only yesterday I've got about the marketing department asking the team for help on signage contracts and wayfinding contracts. Because they see the value that we can add. Traditionally in lots of organizations, the direct side of things is never the purview of the procurement function. It's just the indirects. Well, in here, direct is obviously all the clinical products, not just the med-surg consumables, but it's the capital equipment, Phantom Monty Python, the machines that go ping, all of that stuff. We do. There's nothing really that we do here that we can't influence. So the scope for what we can achieve is just sensational. We're getting involved in IT, getting involved in marketing, getting involved in those areas sometimes that, are sometimes kept away. And we've got the ability to influence an awful lot of spend, recognizing that the stakeholders, the extended stakeholders, is not just our internal stakeholders, but it's also the wider public as well. Wayfinding, for instance, key stakeholder there isn't even necessarily the patient; it's the patient's family. How are we going to ensure that these wayfinders are actually make sense to people who come into a hospital, once every 5 years?
Yeah. So I want to talk today about a little bit about procurement, learning, and development. I think both from an individual perspective, what individual actions we can take to continue our own personal development, but also at an organizational level. I know it's an important topic to you because you and I talk about this offline all the time. And the last podcast that we did together was on influencing skills. So it kind of tied into that as well. But I wonder, there'll be some people who are listening to this that don't know your background in the learning and development space, specifically for procurement. I just wondered if you could share a little bit about kind of where you're coming to this conversation from, because it just gives a little bit of context for listeners.
Sure. Yeah. So I've led learning and development for various consultancies across the UK and Australia for, crikey. This year's my 30th year in procurement. Which is, it's a slightly scary kind of thought in some ways, but there you go. So probably 15 of the last 30 years, or possibly even more, off and on, I've worked in learning and development in terms of designing and delivering programs in procurement and supply chain that are both accredited and non-accredited and vocational type of thing. Coaching people through exams, developing competency frameworks, developing assessment regimes for competency frameworks, trying to make the development dollar go as far as it possibly can. And realistically, I'm just trying to, one of the things that I get passionate about is the scope of what procurement can deliver is immense. The only way that procurement doesn't deliver it, the people do, and the people who work in procurement. And how do we attract talented people to go into procurement? And you'd start off an awful lot of your podcasts with, did procurement find you, or did you find procurement? And it's got to be, I'd go 90%. Procurement found me.
Yeah, probably even more than that. It's such a rarity when somebody deliberately picked procurement out as a career before they actually came across it. Yeah.
So, in some ways, when I'm there's part of me, my altruistic sense to try and even that number up. I'm going to fail. I'm well aware of that. But I'd like people to choose procurement because of the paths that we can show in terms of what it can deliver. Now, part of that is changing the focus and the way that procurement as a function, if you like that word, and from memory, I don't think you do.
I'm not. I'm kind of ambivalent in that I always thought of us as a function. Now I'm starting to think of us as being, that what we does goes beyond a functional silo for sure. And there's no actual reason, or perhaps there's some reasons, but they're diminishing over time of why what we do is within a specific organizational group versus us being more integrated into the business.
Yeah. So let's say, how about profession? And there's some things that we can do that drives the profession forward, that changes the kind of the vision of what that is, and therefore makes people change and do it. And so part of what's going to change the profession is the people in it. And so it's around thinking about the skills and competencies that they want, that they're going to need for the future, not for now, but for the future, and getting people ready for that. So that's kind of my passion, a little bit. And, I go back and forth between, sort of roles in business and industry and roles in consulting, because sometimes I can achieve more as a consultant, and sometimes I can achieve more in the industry. And also what's quite good is we can try out ideas that we've had in consulting and actually bring them into a small group. And there's 54 people who work in procurement and supply chain who are in my team. So yeah, we've got an awful lot of things going on now around some development and some learning and development stuff that's going on. And that's going to evolve over the next period of time, to do certain things different. And we'll talk about that, later on in the podcast. But, so that's kind of sort of my background in procurement L&D, if that helps.
Yeah. And I want to jump into the idea of, competency or capability frameworks, because, we talked a lot on the show over time about what are the skills that a procurement professional may need. And, I think it's well-trodden ground as we talk about how that skill set is changing. But I'm wondering how can we kind of codify that, or how can a leader codify that in their group to say, I need to see these behaviors and these capabilities and competencies in my team if I'm going to execute, and if my team is going to execute on the goals that have been set for us. And to me, a capability framework is a good way of doing that. But when I see them, they're kind of over the map, in terms of whether they exist or how much detail that they go into. So I wonder if you could share some thoughts on, is that really a pillar of kind of building that organizational capability out? And if it is, how do you go about building one?
So I think it is a pillar. I think it's the core pillar. But I think there's a lot of mistakes made. So there are a range of sort of pre-existing competency frameworks, from CIPS to ISM, IACCM. I'm sure there's an awful lot of other acronym organizations out there that have their own. The last two I've created has taken some things from all of them, but you have to make it specific for your organization. That's the first thing. Because what works for one organization does not work for the other. So for me, this idea of one ring to rule them all is wrong, because there's no context to that. I think it has to be specific to your organization, and it has to be specific to your stakeholders. And that's the second thing that I think people do wrong. They do it in isolation. Who ultimately, the competencies that you're trying to bring to your procurement team, the beneficiaries of those competencies, the outputs of those competencies, are your stakeholders. So therefore, why aren't we involving the stakeholders in developing competency frameworks? It's going to do a couple of things. It's going to achieve buy-in from the business as to what are the things that you're trying to do. And two, it's going to stop procurement people speak, and I'm guilty of this, and we're all guilty of this. We speak procurement. Yeah, we'll turn around and say they must be able to do a Porter's 5 forces. And most people in the business are going to go, Porter, who, what, who, what, who? What they're interested in is, can they actually make an assessment of a market and give me some advice around the best way to develop a sourcing strategy? That's what they're interested in. So therefore, it needs to be output driven rather than procurement teams. It's not around being able to do a Kraljex matrix. It's being able to segment your supply markets into different opportunities and help understand, therefore, how much rigor and how much effort you want to put into them. So I strongly believe that when we're thinking about competency frameworks now, we have to involve our stakeholders, and the word pictures that we create, we can call it supply chain analysis, we can call it market analysis. I don't really mind what we're doing here, but it's more around must be able to do something to a certain level. Because that's the thing with the competency framework. It's not one word picture. It's a series of word pictures showing you a different range of competencies. The second thing that I'd be interested in doing with this is, too many times we look at what we need now. And by the time you've improved people, then you're still 18 months behind where you are. So when you're building these competency frameworks, you've got to look 18 months, 2 years, 5 years in advance as to where you want people to be and what your organization needs in 5 years' time. So, and that's why I think these standards are a good kind of touch point. But they're not aligned to your organization. They're not going to be, well, what does my organization need from me in 5 years' time? What's the operating environment in which my organization's working in? How's that going to change? Yeah. What's my organization's maturity level to take things like category management? Yeah. Because if it's not mature enough to take category management, then why are we having a competency around category management?
Yeah, you can build it into your framework. If it's something, if you're taking that 5-year vision of what you want to build for, but you don't necessarily need to assess against it now, or it's okay if that is and I'm just using a random scale, but that you're at a 1 out of 5 today because you have a journey, you're mapping a journey over the next 5 years to get to that 5, rather than looking at it and thinking I'm going to build it for where I want to be today, because you're going to be ranking or assessing the different elements of that and the people within in a different way if you're trying to build for today versus building it for 3 years' time, 5 years' time.
And let's look back 3 years. You and I collaborated on an article a year or so ago, I think, called Days of Future Past, which is I'll take credit for ripping off an X-Men title for the title.
It was over my head.
Most of my titles are rip-offs of either the West Wing quotes or films that I quite enjoy. So we talked about, let's look back, and we looked back at a whole bunch of reports from the Deloitte CPO reports, and A.T. Kearney reports, and a few others as well. Names just disappear from my head for a minute. And we were looking at saying, I wonder how things have changed over the period of time. If we look back 3 years, then would we be as excited about RPA, about NLP, about AI, and how that's going to impact and change our jobs if we look back 3 years ago? Would we actually see a roadmap as to how we could actually use it? I don't think we could have done. I think we know the names, but I don't think how we could see it. And I think the same's true now with blockchain. In 3 years' time, I don't know how blockchain is going to impact my procurement function, but I'm pretty sure it's going to. Yeah, I don't know how it's going to change it, how it's going to affect it. And I don't know if the rest of the technology can catch up with what blockchain can do. And that's one of the things that I learned working for Ariba for a period of time, was just where all the technology is going and what it's heading and what it can do and what RPA and NLP and AI can do. It's there now in virtually every website that we interact with. You're dealing with NLP if you've got a chatbot. Yep. So, it's there in our sourcing stuff. It'll be there in our SRM stuff. And it's going to fundamentally change the levels of competencies and the types of competencies that we're going to need. So we're going to have to think about this. So that's almost the third thing, is that if this isn't right, I've done it now, this is the competency framework and we're going to work to this. I've done the first version of the competency framework. And it's going to be evolving every 18 months, and you're going to be changing it every 18 months because the world changes every 18 months. You know, you've got the tariffs happening in the US right now. So that's going to change the type of analytical insights that you're going to need to bring. I think it was you who actually tweeted this morning, because Harley Davidson are moving some of their manufacturers out, so that people are going to be queuing up for a two-stroke Honda. What does that mean? Well, I don't know what it means, but it means something. It's going to affect some markets.
When you look at a capability framework, I often feel that we try and do too much within them. That they end up being too complex. You know, we're measuring 20 or 30 different competencies, which then, because we're measuring so much, makes it very difficult to have an impact in any. I just wonder what approach that you've taken in building these to make it as manageable as possible. And for not to, because it's easy for us to pick 30 competencies. It's harder for us to pick the 6 that count.
I think it's more about focusing on outputs and the outputs that the teams want to do, and then bring it back to those types of competencies. I mean, the last few that I've written have got a mix of technical and, I call them behavioral skills because I don't like the phrase soft skills. And more the focus is on behavioral skills, because the technical skills, technology, there's a clue in the fact that they share the first 4 letters of the same word, isn't it? Are going to become automated. Not all of them, but they're going to become automated. More and more of it's going to be analytics and insights. I mean, interestingly, I was at a presentation about 12 months ago, and I was talking after Sam Walsh, and Sam's the past president of SIPS. He's also ex-CEO of Rio Tinto, and he started his career in General Motors buying. I think it's General Motors. And he actually said that there's a couple of competencies that he reckons are the most important for procurement. I mean, I'd add a third one, but he talks about data analytics and insights. So the procurement data, and having listened to Doug a couple of weeks ago on the podcast around the importance of master data, I'll echo that. And I'm actually doing that right now in the organization I'm working with now. Is the big thing is around just codifying, classifying the data that we've got, cleaning it, getting it to the point where I can actually look at it and drive some insights as to where do we start. Because, there's lots of opportunities. It's where we start. So data analytics and insights, not the act of cleaning the data, but actually going, okay, so what does it mean? And actually drawing some insights from it is critical as a competency. The second one he talked about was technology. You've got to understand where the technology is going. It's the points we've just been making. And that's a fundamental competency framework. So what are the outputs of the data analytics and insights, and what are the outputs of understanding technology? Mm-hmm.
You mentioned a third that you would add to it.
I would say that the underpinning and the biggest behavioral skill that we have to master is communication. Communication gives us, we talked about this in the last podcast around influencing, biggest driver of being an influential individual is being able to communicate and having multiple ways to communicate. And I talk to my team here around, I had a phone call this morning with one of the guys who works for me, saying, I'm going to pop all this on an email to him. I said, but don't put it on an email, phone him up, talk to him.
It's so easy to write an email these days. In fact, I find that we're allergic to the phone.
Yeah, and it's just recognizing that having good communication skills is fundamental to what we do in procurement if we're seeking to influence the business, the stakeholders, and the suppliers. If we can't communicate and influence them, then we need to get out of the gate.
Now we have capabilities as one other dimension of a capability framework. The other dimension is skill level or competency level. And I've seen a number of different scales for that. Again, I see sometimes when you may have, a very few, a beginner, a proficient and advanced, and you may have others that have 5 or 6 or 7 different levels. How do you approach building that again so that it's usable, that it's targeted enough, but that it doesn't bring in, again, more complexity?
It's interesting. The last one I did, we started off with 4 levels. And at the time, I advised them that I think 5 levels would be better for them. And in general, I don't like using 5 levels, because it's too easy when you're asking people to assess people that they go to the middle. And you want them to actually get off the fence and choose. Is it not good enough or is it good enough? But for them, it was 5 levels. And the reason why it was 5 levels was because of the size of the organization and the different levels of hierarchy that they had, from officers to managers, to senior managers, to leaders, to heads of, etc. So they actually had a relatively high hierarchical status. So I would actually turn around and say that, again, not one size fits all, but you need to have enough to differentiate what a more senior person can deliver as an output to a more junior person. So if you've only got 2 different levels, then you're probably looking at 3. But if you've got 3 or 4, you need 4 or 5 different levels of competency, because the outputs you're going to expect are going to be different.
So we have a capability framework in place. How do you go about building an assessment program to support that? Is it individual assessment, manager-led assessment, a little bit of everything? What have you found to be particularly successful?
I mean, there are 2 types of assessments. There's multiple choice questionnaires, and then there's other assessment regimes, self-assessment, if you like. Problem I find with multiple choice questionnaires is that it tests knowledge, not what actually people deliver. And the whole point of this is it's delivering benefits and value to your stakeholders. So for me, an assessment regime is better to have. We call it 360-degree assessments. 360-degree assessments means you need 4 separate points of assessment. So I personally like self-assessment, manager assessment, stakeholder assessment to actually assess what is being delivered, and finding some kind of peer benchmark is the 4th one, either from within the cohort that you're assessing or a wider sort of cohort. If you can get that consistency of different competencies, if that makes sense. So if you're taking it from 20,000 people, that's fine, but there needs to be some kind of map almost as to what a sorting officer in company A is and a category manager in company B is. For all we know, they might be doing exactly the same job.
Yeah, and if you don't have that, it's at the organization level, so within the peer group that you're assessing within your company.
Yes, absolutely. And if you can't do that, then there needs to be probably an independent assessment. So someone who doesn't work in, who would just come in and do a quick 30, 40-minute interview with people and score them along the same sort of things. And that way you've got the sort of different. And that way you have those four points of assessment, and that'll identify obviously all the sort of gaps that you need to have and what have you. So that's probably from an assessment regime where I'd be looking at, and I'd be making sure that we test outputs.
One of the things you said was about stakeholder assessment. I'm wondering how you go about doing that. Is that multiple choice, or are you going and having somebody interview each of or identifying a key stakeholder and going and doing an interview as a manager with that stakeholder?
It's a mixture of both. I mean, the last couple that I've done, I actually built a very simple SurveyMonkey questionnaire, and we sent it to the stakeholders, and it was really getting them to think contextually around some of the questions they were asking them. When you received person A's, or when you had a meeting with them, did you feel that they were able to articulate what the current market was? Yes, no, didn't understand what they were talking about. When they produced the strategy, was it clear? Did you feel that you were consulted properly, etc.? All those kind of things. So you're asking questions of them, and then you're linking those questions back to competencies. So you're not turning around saying rate them as supply market analysis. You're asking them, what would they have produced from a supply market analysis? Okay, did that make sense?
So that's tying to those outcomes again that you talked about.
Exactly. And then you're looking at their behavioural skills from the communication point of view. Did you feel that you were consulted? When they explained what the strategy would look like, did it make sense to you? Could you follow it? Could you understand it? again, it's all output driven. So you're asking a series of 20 or 30 questions. Hopefully it takes no more than 5 or 10 minutes. And I don't have a problem with either doing that as an interview or doing it via, simple SurveyMonkey question. Again, it's contextually driven. There are some organizations and therefore some stakeholders that would want to have the face-to-face conversation because they've got things they want to say, and they'd feel constrained within a SurveyMonkey.
How do you select who the stakeholders are?
So that is an interesting question, which is normally a consultant's way of saying, let me think about the answer for a minute before I answer it. In the past, we've asked the individuals themselves to come up with stakeholders, and that's both good and bad. Obviously, the risk is that no one's ever going to give someone who's going to sell them down the river. But we do need to ensure that we're doing things with people that they've done a lot, that we're talking to people that they've seen a lot of outputs from over a period of time.
Yeah, so it's not just one data point.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, so I think you'd have to agree it with your manager. You'd have to turn around and go, well, let's get a couple of people that we're talking to. And you'd harmonise those stakeholder scores. You'd nominate one and I'd nominate one. And that's worked well in the past.
Okay. So we have the capability framework. We have the assessments. We got a good idea of kind of the development opportunities for each individual. Now, in my experience, a lot of the time we may have that data and then, just given the nature of budgets, you then kind of put on training programs within a particular skill set that you may have identified more people than not need some help in, but that's not necessarily individual. So have you looked at building something which incorporates individual learner journeys?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, actually the last two that I built were specific for individuals, and it also looked at a whole range of different gap closure activities. I called them because I couldn't think of a catchy name. It's interesting. I'm giving a presentation in when this comes out a couple of weeks ago. As we speak, in about 24 hours time, where we talk about how do we build capacity and capability in the next generation talent. And I kicked it off by looking at a brief history of time, by looking at what the reports have said over the last few years around talent. And they're all saying exactly the same thing. So in 2014, 57% of CPOs didn't think they had enough, the talent wasn't there. And 49% saying they couldn't find any more people. In 2016, it was 48% said that they weren't satisfied. In 2017, it was 52%. In 2018, the best result for a while, it says it's 49% of leaders believe their current teams have sufficient levels. So it's trending down, but it's still half of the people who lead a team don't think their team have got it, and the training budgets have dwindled over time. Yeah. So what's been my next slide is basically a picture of Albert Einstein with a definition of insanity, because clearly we keep doing the same thing. We keep turning around saying, right, we've done an assessment. What training course do you want to go on? And it's mind-boggling that we still keep doing the same things and expect a different result. If it's not been working for so long, then we actually need to try something different. And I think the first thing is recognizing the people who go on this. Sorry, mate.
Yeah, no, if I could just jump in, I wonder if there's a correlation, therefore, between the fact it's not been working and the fact that budgets are reducing. So because there hasn't been impact of training dollars, or maybe not the impact that people want to see, that it makes it harder to actually fight for those dollars because you're wondering, am I really getting an ROI on it?
And absolutely. And I think that's exactly what it is. And I think, the one-size-fits-all programs, again, I said this with competency frameworks. We have technology now that allows us to personalize things for the individual. In the past, maybe we didn't, and maybe that was the problem. But we can actually make things more personal. And the first thing we have to understand is recognize that everyone learns differently. Everyone retains and processes information and decides to do something with them in a different way. And we can help them. We can help them by turning around and asking people to think around what they're going to do differently. Certainly at the end of the training programs that I used to deliver and still do occasionally for my team here, it's okay. We've talked about a lot of stuff over the last 3, 4, 5 hours, but what 2 things are you going to take away from this? Are you going to physically do differently? And write them down, keep them, take a copy of them, give a copy to me, copy for yourself, and in 3 weeks' time we're going to come back and say, are you doing it? Have you done it? How have you done it? And let's share how people have done it. If nothing else, this thing, and actually when I worked for a consultancy, Tanya, I think, came up with the idea of postcards from the future. It's a wonderful idea. It's an absolutely wonderful idea because it's taking back to people to say, this is what you said you were going to do. Are you doing it? It's bringing some of that, hopefully, the ROI, so that you get it. And in consultancy, they talk about, when people start roles, they talk about they've got the first 100 days, and we're like 100. It's a nice round. It's a nice round number. From a training perspective, I talk about you've got 100 hours. From once you've learned something, you've got 100 hours to put it into practice. Because if you don't, the likelihood of success if you put it into practice is just starting to dwindle.
So how can you encourage people to take the learning? Is it in the design of the program, or is it in creating opportunities after a program to actually put those learnings into practice?
It's both, because I think you can actually design the opportunities as part of the program. So I think one of the things that we can have here is a learner journey, and it's personalized for the individual, recognizing that everyone processes information slightly differently. So there's VARC, in terms of how we process information, visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic, and then getting things aligned up to VARC for the individual. So as part of the actual testing regime, I actually think that we need to test how people process information, because that's then going to allow us to personalize that. Is it podcasts like this? Is it vodcasts? Is it webinars? Is it reading journal articles? Is it reading a book? Is it a training course? Is it a workshop where it's more of a workshop than a training course, where you're having sit around the table with a bunch of your peers and you're discussing issues that you're having in certain areas? I've just signed, I've just done something with an organization called PASA in Australia, around the PASA Connect thing, where all my team are now registered on that, and they'll be going to a whole series of workshops where they're networking with their peers and figuring out ways of doing that. Information sharing is actually a really important piece for their development. I think there's a lot more that we can do around the individual learner journey linked to how they process information. And also, as part of that, drawing an ROI out, because you can make, as part of that learner journey, opportunities for application.
And it's about driving actions, not proving competency. It's something that I've found. So when we look to assess, oftentimes in the learning and development space, we're asking questions just to demonstrate that you understood a concept, not that you actually put that concept into place and actually then drove an ROI from it. So when you look at the Kirkpatrick scale, for example, it's the how did we actually make a difference, and did that learning allow me to make a difference?
Essentially, we're talking about changing people's behaviors and changing people's actions. So people have, under pressure, people will default to the thing that they've always done. And what you've got to do is we've got to change what people have always done to what it is that we want them to do. And the only way that we can do that is to get them to do it. Because then what we're doing is we're changing that neural pathway, that instead of putting your left sock on first, you're going to put your right sock on instead. And it is just changing those behavioral things, and replacing them with actual better practice. And the only way we're going to get them to do that is to try it, practice and practice and practice.
So I know we're coming up on time. There's, as usually happens, there's some of the areas that I could have gone and wanted to go, and I guess we'll have to leave those for another day. But a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned the podcast actually with Doug Paul, and the first time we did a quick fire round, and the feedback that I got from that was positive. So you're going to be my second guinea pig. And basically how it goes is I just have 4 or 5 different really quick questions just to get your perspective on, as you hear me ask it, talk about it. It's not to really elaborate on, but I just love your thoughts. And so the first one is the value of a professional procurement certificate.
So speaking personally, I'm FSIPs and MSIPs by qualification, by examination, a long time ago in a country far, far away. And during my early years in procurement, I found it invaluable. I found it invaluable. And certainly if you want to work in certain parts of the world, having that professional procurement certificate is an absolute essential. You see it on job adverts, must be MSIPs, and I don't know what it's like in the US. It says must be certified supply chain. Yeah, okay. And it's not quite so much in Australia either. So what I would say to people is, what is it you want to get out of it, and what do you want to use it for? Because there are lots of ways. If it's to do with learning, then yes, there's absolutely some stuff that you can learn from it. But if it's just for getting a piece of paper, then it just depends on where you want to work.
So how much time should a listener dedicate to their own personal development each week?
That's a good question. One of the things I've said to the guys here is, I'm happy to give you, as part of your work, an hour every week where you do it within work's time, as long as you match that personally yourself. So an hour of my time, an hour of your time. So with that, if I was to say that, a couple of hours every week is probably a good starting point. I probably do a little more than that, because a lot depends on how you classify as learning. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. I have an hour's commute every day, and certainly for at least 2 to 3 of those days, I'm listening to development podcasts such as yourself, HBR, the Economist podcasts, Things You Should Know podcasts, all sorts of different things where you're going to get ideas from. Malcolm Gladwell's podcast is exceptional. You'll get ideas about how people deal with things, real life, which you can potentially bring into your day-to-day work. So for me, it's something that I'm always doing. But if you wanted to specifically set aside a time, I think a couple of hours a week is a good start. If you're doing certificates and exams, you're going to need to do a lot more than that.
So you probably answered most of my next question about sources of information that you use to support your own personal development. Is there any others that, aside from the podcasts that you mentioned, that are your go-tos?
I get quite a few RSS feeds. So I'll go to I've got a folder in my emails. It's called Stuff to Read. So I get a lot of stuff from GEP because Andrew Bartolini produced an awful lot of good stuff, from procurement transformation to CPO rising, etc. So that's good. SIG. So I subscribe to an SIG thing, which is, whilst it's in the US, I think there's some really interesting things there. And again, it looks at some webinars and what have you. Spend Matters produce quite a lot of good things. Procurement Leaders, Mark Pereira. I'm a big fan of Mark and some of the stuff that he does. So that's quite good. Hackett Group generally produce quite a lot of good research reports. And so I try and subscribe to as many of those different things as I can. I'm a member of SIPS, so they also, as part of my membership, they have a knowledge base, which I think has been partnered with an organisation called Barrow. And that's got more category stuff than development stuff, but it's still quite interesting because, part of what I believe in is most new ideas already exist, but they exist somewhere else in a different context, and they're waiting to be discovered by you for your context. So that's one. And PASA, I think, they send some interesting things out as well. And the good things with things like PASA and like SIPS is that they do a lot of collation of other things as well that you can actually read and click through on the links. So I try and spend some time doing that, and I've got a subscription to the New York Times, and that's quite interesting.
So last question, what's your perspective on e-learning?
It should be part of any integrated development plan. And I think from where it was 5-10 years ago to where it is now, 5-10 years ago, it was essentially PowerPoint slides on, is it Canva or something like that, with someone talking over the top of them. That's not really e-learning, is it? And I think it's come on massively to where it is now. And I think the category of e-learning is a lot broader. That being said, I still think that training courses where you're face to face and probably more workshops than training courses, but I still think they are a part of any development plan. But it's not exclusive. I think the problem that we've had is that they've been the exclusive domain of how we develop people. And I think they're part of a solution. They're not the only part of the solution. But I think where there's more value in them are the more workshop styles where you're not teaching someone how to do a Porter's 540s, but you're more talking about the outputs of what that looks like.
And so the very last question, and as I always say, it's the easy one. Where can listeners go to connect with you if they want to talk about any of these topics a little bit more?
Best place, like probably everybody else, is LinkedIn. So I've got a LinkedIn profile. I also am on Twitter, where I post some things both to do with football, but sometimes to do with procurement as well. And I like to share articles that I find, or share podcasts that I find really, really interesting and useful. And I do that both on LinkedIn and Twitter. So my Twitter is at gdonovan1971, which might tell you what year I was born in.
All right. Well, and by the time this comes out, people will either go there and find you on Cloud 9 because of the football, or find you talking more about procurement again.
Yes. Well, the only good news is by the time this comes out, the Premier League will be close.
Yeah, and something else to talk about.
and I'm quite happy about that from last season.
All right, Gordon. Well, I really, really appreciate you spending time with me. And if for listeners who want to check out a lot of the links that Gordon talked about, I'm going to put those in the show notes. Just search for Gordon Donovan on the Art of Procurement website, and this episode will come up along with the interview that Gordon and I did. What was 2+ years ago. It was crazy. We were looking back to see when it was. It didn't seem like it was so long ago, but time flies by.
It does indeed. And I think there's some articles that you and I co-wrote on there as well.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me, Gordon.
No worries. Pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.